one thing you'll notice about me, I try to, when I discuss the war in Gaza or anything related to Israel, I typically try to rely on Jewish voices, just because it's a little less difficult to call me an anti-Semite that way. Even though people will do it because, people that are Jewish get called anti-Semites all the time. But this conversation that Dave Smith had with Ari Shaffir, I thought was really good, because Ari Shaffir is one of those dudes who's always been kind of like outspoken. And I don't know if you saw the thing he did with Howie Mandel. Howie Mandel was talking about anti-Semitism, and Ari Shaffir was the guy who was like,
it's horrible. It's not horrible. It doesn't happen. It's statistically irrelevant. It should be on the news too much. None of it's really happening.
Are you
I've
fucking
been all
kidding
over
me?
the country. I've seen no actual anti-Semitism. Have you? You look Jewish. You walked around, people yelled Jew at you or something?
I don't go out.
Yeah, good point.
I don't go out.
I yelled Jew at him this morning.
Yeah.
No. I think it's real.
No.
I think we got to take it seriously. I think what you're saying is wrong.
No, it's being on the news. Are you familiar with the what's that app that tells you all the robberies in your neighborhood? Citizen app.
Yeah.
So before this app, everybody was having a great time in their neighborhood. And then suddenly all these housewives are like, there's a robbery every 20 minutes. I can't believe everything's going to shit. They're just aware of it suddenly, the small percentages. It's a little bit in colleges you don't go to. It's not there. It's statistically irrelevant. I go all over the country. I've never seen any anti-Semitism.
Just based on their kind of who they are as people, Dave Smith and Ari Shaffir, I think that they both have a lot of integrity. And as Jewish men, they kind of speak the truth. Sometimes I think I might not always agree with all the nuance of everything that they're saying, but there's a couple just highlights in here that I wanted to touch on. So the first one here is they're talking about the dynamic between Jewish people or people who are critics of Israel and being called anti-Semites or Nazis. And believe me, we've talked about this before. I did a whole piece, Nazis Are Us, on the Daryl Cooper thing. But in this case, he kind of explains the dynamic and how it gets when you're someone who's kind of out there speaking the truth on this subject, and people are like, oh, well, you must be anti-Jewish, you must be a Nazi. And it's like, sometimes people just get to the point where like, okay, fuck it, I'm a Nazi. Like throw their papers up in the
man with a vagina.
And if you want to go after Israel's policy on something, there is then those people going, you hate Jews, right? But at the same time, you'll have people going, it's all the Jews. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You get people who start to just, friends of ours who start to fucking hate this Israeli war, and they go fully into just fucking hating Jews.
Oh, has he?
Yeah.
Really?
And it's wild because they go, well, who's coming after me, telling me to be quiet? It's the Jews. So you just broaden that to this, but I think it's all online. Those guys are never going to say anything to me. Fuck.
So what's funny too is we just covered this a few minutes ago, but there is an organized effort to make those critics seem like those types of people. I just talked at the beginning of this about, Majid Nawaz was talking about how the Likudnik party backs these media outlets to do these kind of ops to make people think that anyone who's a critic of Israel or the war in Gaza is an anti-Semite. So Ari, I think, kind of misses that a little bit.
You Jew, not even that much in person.
Listen to what Dave.
But they do start adding that in.
So
I've watched part of it.
I've watched that happen with several people I know who basically essentially started with making really reasonable points, and then they got labeled a Nazi, and then at a certain point we're like, fuck you, I'm a Nazi. And look, so it was Curtis Yarvin who said this once. I thought it was really well said, that he was basically like, well, look, if the kind of progressive establishment has this worldview that you're either lockstep with us or you're a Nazi, and you end up being like, well, fuck you, then I'll be a Nazi. It's like, you understand you've still conceded their worldview. Yeah. You're really just reinforcing it because you've essentially agreed that the only options are to be like a woke progressive or a Nazi. And that, so anyway, so to your point, there's no question that happens. Point. I kind of look at it like, okay, if there's let's say there's a neighborhood and there's a real problem with black crime in that neighborhood. This is hypothetical, doesn't exist in the real world, but let's just say there was a real problem with black crime in a neighborhood. And black people are running around and they're just randomly beating the shit out of white people. Okay. It's maybe of the black population in that area, it's only like a couple percentage of the black people who are doing this, but this is happening all the time. There's probably going to be a rise in anti-black sentiment. You know what I mean? Right. Now, it is true that it's totally unfair to blame a black dude in that area who wasn't beating people up.
Right.
And he's like, I don't know, dude, I'm over here. At the same time, I would also say if you're a black leader in that neighborhood, the first thing you say should probably be like, hey guys, we got to stop beating people up. The first thing you say probably shouldn't be like, I'm appalled by this rise in racism, because it's like,
but that is that would be what they'd say.
Right. But I'm just saying like that.
Yeah, right.
I have no problem with you saying that second, but I do just think that, and maybe this is being a little bit collectivist in my mind. Maybe you don't have an obligation. That's just kind of how I feel.
Blossom did that.
Blossom, the TV show?
No, the lady from Blossom.
So I think that's a good point. And the analogy he's using is a little clumsy, but you can't attribute that to everybody. And this is kind of the point that Vivek was making in one of the last shows I did, one of the other shows where he was kind of talking to this person in a town hall, and the guy was talking about how, because of the Haitian comment that Trump made at the debates, like there's a rise in racism. And Vivek's kind of like, well, maybe that's real, but also, this is a division tactic that gets used to say like, oh, okay, people that have legitimate concerns about immigration are all racists. And so I think that's kind of the point that Dave is making here. And this is where they talk a little bit about this issue in context with Daryl Cooper, who Dave recently did a podcast with, and kind of had to almost like defend on Piers Morgan.
Like, dude, this guy, Daryl Cooper, he's been very like all over the place lately, because he was just on Tucker Carlson and stirred up some controversy. He was just on my show a couple days ago. But he's just brilliant historian, and he did this this series called Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. It's like it's a big time commitment. It's I think
I recommend listening to it. I know it's long, but if you listen to that, it's pretty evident that he's not a racist. He goes into some pretty deep nuance that no one in the Zionist media is touching.
I think it's 27 hours long. Ooh. It's a 6-part podcast series about the early history of the creation of the state of Israel. And it is just so good. Like, I cannot recommend it high enough. It's so good. But so he goes through in detail everything. And when you consume something like that, or if you really do the reading about like the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the first thing you realize is like it's enormously complex, and it is a constant reaction to the last thing. And you could see pretty easily where, like, you get to a point where if your kid was one of the people at this music festival, and like you're just not even hearing it.
I don't want to. It's
like
fuck
flatten Gaza. It's very easy to get yours just flat.
People like, he said this, like, yeah, it's war, man. It's war. Everybody's acting like crazies.
Likewise, if you're living in Gaza, you can understand where you get to a point where you're like, I'm going to join up with Hamas because we're going to kill whoever we can kill. So it's this constant cycle. But anyway, at the end of it, at this long 27-hour podcast series,
this is actually really good, and like probably one of the high point clips where he talks about a potential solution. I don't know that it would necessarily work, but listen to what he says. And this is part from Daryl's
He goes
podcast.
through this whole thing about what he thinks could actually help the situation. And he kind of almost prefaces it. He's like a hard right-wing guy. This was a guy who was a veteran, was like, a contractor in the military, has been to Israel many times, and worked with the IDF and stuff. And he basically goes, like, he kind of disclaims it by like, these are my words, not his, but he goes, yeah, I know this sounds kind of gay or whatever, but he goes, here's the truth. In acknowledgement of what's been done wrong in the past can actually go a long way. And he tells this story. It's actually really beautiful, but he tells this story about how there was essentially...
It's kind of what we did with the Native Americans.
Turkey finally did.
Yes, exactly. But he tells the story because he was like fought in the terror wars. And he tells the story about the teams that used to have to go in to these areas like in Iraq and Afghanistan where whatever, a drone bomb had killed a family, like we missed the target or we got bad intel and we just killed a family. Yeah. And they'd go there and essentially offer them money You know, like they'd be like, listen,
sorry.
We're very sorry about what we did. We can give you, and it comes out to like something, you know, it'd be like $7,000 or something like that they're giving. Yeah. And he was talking to one of his friends who was doing those missions. And he said he even asked him, I think, go listen to this on the episode, but I'm just retelling it as much as I can remember it. But he said he'd almost be like, oh my God, did that go like horrifically bad every single time? And because he's thinking that's like horribly insulting to be like, your kid was worth $7,000. And the guy he was talking to went like, no, usually went really good. Because sometimes it went bad, but for the most part, they really appreciated that someone was at least acknowledging that like this was really wrong what we did. And he was like, his like almost like thing was that like there should be like some like you just said, we can't pretend anymore that 300 years is all that's been. You can't pretend what didn't come before it, and that like you should almost like stop pretending that like, you know, the Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, we just declared our independence, and then they've all hated us for eternity over that.
This happens in feminism too. We're like, don't pretend like you haven't just like grabbed your secretary's ass for fucking 80 years, and you're like, okay, but also don't pretend like no woman is fake Me Too'd somebody.
You know,
you're acting like all these things just exist in vacuums, and it's like, come on, it's all of these things.
My take on the Israel situation essentially is that you're like, look, it's not that there's just this one thing or that there's just this other thing, but fundamentally, if you want to talk about the conflict that's going on over there, the fundamentals are that a group of Eastern Europeans decided they wanted to start a new nation for Jews, which for good reason. They were like, we think we've been so persecuted here that we need our own state or we're never going to be able to live like this. And they went to an area that was already inhabited by people and decided we're going to start a state here. And they got international financing and they put it together. I mean, they got everything they needed to get it done. And in the process, whether you say it's intentional or not, in the process of creating this state, about 750,000 people were kicked out of their homes, either forcefully or they fled and weren't allowed to come back.
Was a lot,
but they weren't allowed to come back at the end of the war. And then after the 6-Day War in 1967, Israel occupied Gaza and, well, they took East Jerusalem, they occupied Gaza and the West Bank, right? And essentially have occupied them ever since. Now, they could say that they had the pullout in 2005 and whatever. They dominated Gaza ever.
So I think Dave makes some of the best points I've heard on that. I'm always calling him out as one of the better voices in the media on this subject, especially since he's a Jewish guy. It's just a little more potent, I think, because of that reality. So they also talked about something I didn't know a lot about, but the relationship between Jewish people and Black people during the Civil Rights movement. And I thought this was really interesting because it's not something I really thought much about. I've read Malcolm X's biography, but I didn't really kind of pick up on this whole thing right here. So anyway, check this out. People during the
started
Civil Rights.
The tension between Blacks and Jews. And like, if people don't know the history of it, like Jews were very instrumental in the Civil Rights movement. They were
the only ones really would go down there and get hung to fucking support Black rights.
And a huge part of like the organization of it, because you had like a lot of like
Blacks are a lot of things. They're not on time much. So they've never been accused of being too punctual.
Well, and if you think
the Jews go down and be like, hey guys,
but also you think about the fact that it was Jews from the North who were coming down to Mississippi to help like the Black kids, because it wasn't Black adults, it was mostly Black teenagers, people in their 20s, because their parents had to work and couldn't risk their jobs, but they would go. So these were the kids growing up in rural poverty in Mississippi under segregation. They were not educated. They were not.
That's something I never thought about, is that they were, most of the civil rights protesters were really young.
Prepared. The Jews came in with financing and education and all this shit. And so they were kind of working together. And then there like a big rift started by the late 60s. And one of the huge parts of this was the war in 1967 and Israel taking over control of God, and that Malcolm X and all these guys, they were the Black kind of like, they identified with the Muslims and they were like, no, fuck this. These Jews are the white persecutors of the Muslims. Who's the Muslims? Us. Who's the white people? White people. And so this, like, they
they grouped everybody, and then it became like, no, I'm currently representing you pro bono and taking death threats. I'm not them.
I'll say there was certainly some sloppy thinking on their part, but it wasn't without a point. Like there was some point to what they were saying, and there was something where the Jews, the only African nation that they allied with at first, very unfortunately happened to be South Africa, who was an apartheid regime at the time. So if you were like,
that's very interesting. One of the things that surprised me in the most recent like outbreak of war in the Middle East is how many of the Israeli guys on TV have South African accents. One of the things that kind of goes unnoticed in these conversations.
A radical black nationalist. What do you mean? Because you already got to think, right? There was already this friction between, broadly speaking, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, right? So Martin Luther King was essentially, at least for the day, I'm not saying he was a socialist too, but for the day and his cause, he was essentially a liberal. He was essentially saying like, hey, let's just extend the Bill of Rights to include black people also. But that's in a sense almost an endorsement of the American system, saying like, oh, America's failed on its promise. This was his line in the I Have a Dream speech, right? With the line about we were given a check, but when we deposited it said insufficient funds.
Right.
So he's basically saying like, hey, we got this document that says all men are created equal, and yet then when it comes down to life in America, we're not treated that way. Malcolm X and these more radical black nationalists were like, fuck America, that's the white person's, that's the white man's government. We want to form our own thing. We should go for, right? So you already have this kind of, and then, okay, you got
neither one are right or wrong. There's just two ways of looking at it.
Sure. There's things that are appealing about each of them, I think, to be honest, and things that are unappealing about each of them.
On the word white power, I mean black power.
Who's Malcolm X?
No, it was one of the underlings. And he goes, and they held this group of kind of traveling speakers, and Martin Luther King was like the leader for sure. And they had like some fights about who's whatever. And he goes, Martin Luther King had a speech somewhere else, couldn't make this one. And he goes, well, he wasn't there, and he couldn't stop him from saying. So I said, and he shows the speech, and he goes, oh, I was talking about white power. What about black power? And this guy's such a good speaker. The way like.
So the thing about black power too, if you read any of the documentation that the Black Panthers put out, it's not about dominance over white people. It's about equality. Black power is black equality. So I think, a lot of the smear campaigns during the civil rights movement were designed to scare white people into thinking that, oh, black people are coming to take over your communities and marry your daughters. And anyway.
TD Banks is and all those people. And he goes, what about black power? And they go like, black power. And he just keeps going, black power. And they're like, black power. And he goes, Martin Luther King came back, but it was too late.
Yeah.
The word stuck.
Well, right. So imagine you're in this camp, and let's say, which I think almost all of us could kind of understand, if you were a black person living during segregation or something like that, you could certainly understand where you might be attracted to the Malcolm X argument. Malcolm X is like sitting there and saying let's take
this is really good actually
power, and like saying like
they'll never give it to us.
He goes, look, essentially the split was like, okay, and Malcolm X would needle Martin Luther King for this essentially, right? That Martin Luther King, if you got some white cops who are coming in who are roughing up your wife in front of you, and Malcolm X would be like, so what is Dr. King telling us I should do? Write a letter to my congressman? I'm telling you, get a gun and kill that fucking cop. That cop puts his hands on your wife. What type of man are you if you allow another man to put his hands on your wife? So now, whether you agree with that or not, you could certainly see where that would be appealing to a certain, demographic in the black community at that time. And so then you're a little bit frustrated with the Martin Luther King branch. You're almost like, that's almost a sellout, And then Israel is aligned with South Africa. They're oppressing their black people, and then you could spin it as, and Israel's oppressing their black people, the Arabs, right? And then you find out that the Jews have been funding the Martin Luther King wing of your black movement. And so it's very easy after that to be like, oh, I see what you're doing here, and then
like, no,
of course, and look, the relationship between blacks and Jews, since then, right, is one where it's almost always, I mean, not 100% of the time, but 99% of the time, there's a serious power imbalance. Now, I'm saying the relationship between blacks and Jews typically in black neighborhoods is landlord, renter, store owner, customer.
Stick to themselves.
Yes, yeah, and like you even talked about that thing, the guys who have their own ambulances who don't pick up your kids in their ambulances. I mean, this is all real shit, Yeah. And so anyway, I guess the broader point I was just making is that when you see that BLM tweet on October 7th, it's not just a reaction to October 7th.
Also,
these are radical black activists, and they have a long history of being very suspicious of Jews.
It's also not
Dave Smith laying it down. Very, very salient point. And that's a history that I was unaware of too. So that whole like the funding thing. And I didn't even know that Israel supported South Africa during apartheid that much. That's wild. So anyway, a couple more little clips from this I wanted to talk about. There's another one where they talk about the anti-war left and how they've kind of disappeared.
So I was talking to them, and I was kind of asking them because they're left wingers and I'm not. So I was kind of like asking them, like, I was like, why do you think it is, that so many people, like, say at college campuses, because like my question was almost like it's like there's this return of the anti-war left, and I'm like, okay, interesting. Where the hell you been? Really missed you since Dick Cheney was in the Oval Office until now. I haven't heard anything from you. So it's kind of nice that you're back, but it also does make you a little bit suspicious of like, why, and I said something like, I was like, well, where were they, when Obama launched a war in Libya and Syria and this,
but 25-year-olds weren't there.
Well, that's a good point. But what Crystal Ball said to me, which was like kind of fairly obvious, but as she said it, it was like,
it's crazy to think that it's been almost 20 years since Obama was elected.
Really is truth to this. Is she was just 15. Like, look, the truth is, she goes, for these young people, these like 20-year-olds, number one, they didn't see all of those wars. Number two, those wars weren't on social media the way this one is.
True.
And it is, when you see
death, and
dude, the war in Iraq, if you remember, the video footage you got from it was like grainy night vision with like what looked like a firework going off and then and that's one thing. But what I see on social media every day for the last year is a baby suffocating to death. And it's like, dude, it is understandable where in that environment, you just can't get away with this shit the same way you did. It's not, dude, I'm talking about, it's bad for your health. But I've seen videos out of Gaza that are just like, God damn, heartbreaking.
They had this picture display in Romania and Bucharest, I think. And it was just because they're worried about Russian invasion. They're like, well, we're pretty close. Like they're worried. And so there's pictures of this, like, and it's like, like high level photographs. And it was like, this man was going out for bread. A bomb hit him. He's dead. His family's crying over his dead body. And you're like, oh, it's so visceral. There's also this weird thing with the media of fake news, of like misreporting so much and then not getting to the people any sort of, I don't know if they are saying, hey, that was wrong. This idea that like they won't let him go to Egypt, and then later, actually, Egypt's not letting him in. Or hey, the Israeli side was doing this. Actually, they were pretty bad on that. Or hey, Israel bombed the hospital. Oh, actually, it was a mosque by accident. It's just this misreporting stuff. Or in Syria of like, look at this little girl walking down the street. It's like, that's a music video from 7 years ago.
Yeah. See, and we'll stop there, but there's a lot of that stuff. Again, I'm very skeptical of all of that stuff because to me, a lot of that stuff, like Majid Nawaz talked about in our first piece, is funded by groups that support the war. So they're actually, I mean, you look at the stuff that the ADL is doing, you look at the stuff that all these organizations are doing, and it's not a leap to go, oh, like these people are feeding major media outlets fake news so they look stupid, so that whenever Israel or the US does anything that is worth criticism, people can go, oh, well, you lied about that one thing a couple weeks ago, so we don't trust your take on this. And the idea that the media is like critical, like especially the corporate media is critical of, the war in Gaza or even the war in Ukraine. We just went over the propaganda around that.